ports that are on the back of the console. So again, we can, it comes set up default 1 to 4, but as we've often said, you could use those 4 ports as a 4-way splitter if you wanted to, and you can say, okay, I want all of them to go to universe 1. And now all 4 ports are going to be outputting universe 1, and you've got effectively a 4-port splitter in the back of your desk. Or you might want to say, I'm really only using 2 universes, so now you've got 2-port splitters. So there's a lot of flexibility there that allows you to just define what goes where. The advanced routing is for if you're using ShowNet. I won't go too deep into, I won't really cover this off too much, but I don't know if you have any experience with ShowNet. ShowNet allows you to actually do partial universes. So you could say channels 150 through to 250, they go here, and channels 300 to 325, they go over here. It's messy. I say to people, if you can avoid using that, then do. I think they've taken the world's the world's simplest protocol, DMX, and made it as complicated as they could.
Okay.
So
we just skip that.
Yeah. So I avoid it as much as I can, but
yeah.
Anyway. Okay, so just moving on, system settings tab, these are global to the product, and you'll see there's a note down here that says that these settings are not stored with the show. So that means that if you take a show file and move it to another system, the settings that you're seeing in this screen won't travel with you unless it's a packed show. So a packed show will obviously. And so this allows you to set things like the on level, up and down. If you're using the wheel, how the sensitivity of the wheel, what the Grandmaster buttons do. I mean, most of this stuff is fairly self-explanatory. Down in the bottom half here is where you can see all the automatic backup options that I talked about earlier. So by default, this is where it's going to store any backup files. You'll see here the number of automatic backups in this case is set to 10. So that means the oldest one will automatically get deleted. And we've got this set to back up every 5 minutes. Now, it will also only back up if it detects a change. So it's not, if you don't record a cue or make anything that changes anything, then it won't do a backup. It's backup every 5 minutes after someone's made a change. And you can also set a secondary backup location. So you might want to always back up to a USB stick. So that's where the USB port that's actually in the drawer of the console is really useful, because you could just stick a USB stick in there, set that as your secondary backup location, and now you've got a removable drive that's always got backups. So the intermediate tab is just a lot more advanced options. I really don't want to go through, I won't bother going through all of these, but there are a lot of options in there for different ways of operating, people who are used to other consoles, for example. So one that I can see here, immediacy selector, no, that's not the one I was thinking of. Trying to think of an obvious one that differs between different console manufacturers. I can't think of anything at the moment, but and then advanced, again, even more deeper options, you could say, with the software. So we won't go into that in too much detail. Now, show defaults. So this is the information that is stored with the show. So when you move a show from one system to another, all of these settings are going to follow. And this is where we, unlike sort of setting, this is more about sort of default options. So record timing, whether or not, this is actually the place where people who, this is where really people who operate different consoles will work differently. So for example, some of the more common ones that people come and change is these ones down here. So for example, this one here, release channels after a record or update. So that's a really important one where particularly the live event guys, they have a tendency to want the channels to remain captured in their programmer after they do a record or something. Whereas more in the theatre world, you're more inclined to, you make your change, you do your record, and those channels get released and the queue becomes active. So and similarly, this one here, release channels on QGo. So again, more on the theatre side, if they make some changes and they have to hit the go button, then they expect those channels to be released and for the queue to take control. Live event, they're more inclined to say, no, I've captured those channels. I'm working on them. I want them to be left alone when I run a queue. So those ones are probably the most common two options that people change depending on their preference for running things. But there's also other ones that are quite common as well, like whether or not it records submasters by default. So if I record a queue, will the submaster levels be included in that queue? Some want that on, some want that off. And I'll actually show you, there's a quick way to, these three options here. Can you see my mouse, by the way? You can, cool. I just,
yes.
Here I am pointing at stuff saying, do you see this? And I didn't actually confirm that. Yeah, so there's, so these three options here, actually, I'll talk about it just right now. This include running effects, include submasters, and include palettes. They're all on by default, but you'll see up here these three boxes that are next to record live up in the very top right-hand corner of the screen. There's a FX, sub, and palette. If I'm just going to close this out. Discard changes. Yeah, okay. I didn't make any changes. I didn't think. You can actually click on these to turn these various options on and off. So if I don't want it to record submasters, I can just turn that off like that. Obviously on the command line, I can do record queue minus sub. So there's command line ways to do this, but if you want to globally do it, you can quickly turn those options on and off by clicking on that. So going back to show defaults, what else to cover in here? Again, I mean, there's lots of options. These are the defaults for groups and palettes, different record modes, different default group behaviors. Partitioning, we won't go into partitioning. You know, again, if that's something you want to cover, we can cover it near the end. And other settings, such as your default filter library that you want to use, setting up shortcuts to run on startup. So that's macros to essentially run on startup. Setting the lock code for if the console's locked, and a background image for that. So yep, again, you know, we can go into any options more deeper when you have questions. Next tab, network access. So this is how we can access the console from like a mobile remote, or connect into it in various different ways. The defaults, so the default settings in here should allow like the mobile remote to work without any problem. So for the most part, you wouldn't need to go and change anything in here. You know, so unless you're doing a job that required, you know, probably more on the architectural side where you have a lot of external triggers wanting to come in, or you have some third-party product that wants to trigger something, then you probably won't need to change any of the defaults in here. By default, the web server is turned off, so it does have a built-in web server. So that's turned off by default, and normally, yeah, receiving UDP packets is turned off by default. So again, we can go into more detail about that. This is also where we set up a tracking backup system. So, so if we are running a RAC Neo or a secondary system, and that's going to be our backup, it's very, very simple to set up a tracking backup in Neo. You simply need to turn it on to say this system is going to be a tracking backup, give it the IP address of the master system, and restart. Essentially, when it restarts, it'll come up as a tracking backup. It will sync up with the other system and follow along with whatever that other system is doing. One thing to be aware of with our the way we do tracking backup is that a tracking backup has its own copy of the show file, and it doesn't automatically sync. You do need to, there's a button, you can basically, on both the master and the backup, there's a button to synchronize the show file. So that's essentially pull the show file from the master down to the tracking backup. And the idea and the logic behind that is that, you know, you want to isolate your backup, your tracking backup as much as possible, so that if you do something on the main that causes it to crash, for example, you do something out of the ordinary and you do it to crash. Now, you don't want whatever you did on that system to automatically sync up with the backup and have the backup now crash. So you want those to be as isolated as possible. So a tracking backup has its own copy of the show file. It runs pretty much fully independent of itself. It's just getting messages of playback. It's essentially receiving playback messages from the master system to say, okay, you should be on this queue, this submaster should be up. And so it keeps all that information in sync, but it doesn't keep show changes in sync. You have to manually push or pull them from the main system. So that is probably the most secure way to ensure that your backup doesn't accidentally get corrupted and can always take over if it needs to. There's a number of appearance settings, changing font sizes and things like that. I don't think anything's really worth digging into too deeply there at the moment. The registration tab just shows the registration code and allows you to upgrade. Again, pretty self-explanatory. Visualizer tab, this is where we can turn on and off visualizer access. So this is a direct communication with the visualizer. So both Capture and WYSIWYG are supported, and just a few options as to whether or not, you know, for example, it does autofocus, or whether or not patch information is transferred, depending on supported. Capture is actually the product we are the most integrated with, I would say. So you get the most features out of Capture. It's certainly my product preference. Remote options. So this is referring to if you're using multiple consoles that are all working on the same show file. Again, we can come back to this. I don't want to get bogged down into these details. Media settings determines things like what screen video is going to play on, what audio device you're going to use. There's a number of settings in that there. Again, not worth spending too much time on. And likewise, special shortcuts. Well, if we get to shortcuts and talk about what they can do, these are just sort of a whole series of special macros, built-in macros, you could say. So that's the system properties. Is there anything that, any options you want to know, or, you know, where's the option to do this or anything like that, that you have a question at the moment?
Hi, Martin. So regarding the remote options, right?
Yes.
Is it possible to run a console over the internet? So for example, let's say I'm in a broadcast studio. I have a console set up. I've got my light set up. But because of the current situation, I'm working from home. Is it possible for me to dial into the console from my home and control it from my home?
Yes, you can. That is possible. To be honest, I would be inclined to use some sort of, probably the easiest way would just be some sort of remote desktop scenario. There's kind of like, there's a lot of ways